Fabian will give a much more comprehensive view into the sector and what Rystad is seeing, forecasting, and analyzing. Fabian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for introduction. Let me just share my screen first here. Can you actually give me the option to share? I get this message of you cannot share while other participant is sharing.
Yeah, Udaya, can you do that?
I'll try one more time. No, I still get the same message. Let me try now. Yeah, now it's working. There we go. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, it works. I think you're still in. Yeah, now you're in presentation mode.
Okay, perfect. Great. Yes, thanks for the introduction, Michael, and hello everyone. Great to meet you. So my name is Fabian Rønningen, and I work in the Renewables and Power team in Rystad Energy. So we cover sort of the whole energy market, and of course, solar is playing an increasingly important role here. So this is something that we're trying to track very closely, and I hope you met some of my colleagues for those of you who attended SNEC and also Intersolar last month. But for this presentation, I think I have three main sections. First, focusing on demand. Will we sort of see another record-breaking year with similar growth rates to last year, or is there some slides of a slowdown in the market? Then we're moving over to supply. I think sort of, Michael already touched on it, but the oversupply story is still sort of the dominating story on the supply side. So I think it's, important to touch on that before finally wrapping up with some trends on the price side and some of the implications that we're seeing in the power market, on the cost side with LCOEs, the curtailment rates, and also some of the capture price trends, as some of these, key markets are getting very, very high amounts of solar PV in their power mix now. So let me just jump right into it. I just want to start with sort of the high level slide. So this is basically showing our most updated view that we published in a quarterly report just a couple of weeks ago. And just to start with 2023 first, as Michael already mentioned, it was a record year. It was surprising for some of us to see all of these additions. And a lot of these additions also came quite late in the year. So I think a lot of analysts and also probably industry, participants were sort of a bit surprised by the numbers, right? But we saw, more than, close to 450 gigawatts DC added to the grid globally, with the Asia region sort of dominating the growth. And before I go into the regional drivers, I would say sort of what we are seeing in the market now is that we think it's unlikely that we will see another record year with 60, 70, 80% growth, but still very, very high activity levels, growth in all markets, and also growth across most of the segments. But let me get back to that in the regional breakdown. But also quickly touching on the segment side first, what we are seeing right now is very high activity levels on the utility side, and that's typically also where there is a bit more transparency on the market side, and there is very high activity all across all across the main regions, with US, Europe seeing record years, still very high activity levels in China and other important markets. But for example, on the residential solar PV market, we think it's actually going to be a slight reduction this year, and I'll get back to the reasons for that. But before we go into the regional breakdown, I just want to put this in context, right? Like what we are seeing now in the market is that solar is representing a larger and larger share of the global installed capacity mix. With actually next year, with this forecast presented on the previous slide, we will surpass 20% of all installed capacity globally will be solar PV. And this is, of course, having quite big implications when it comes to the generation mix, the capture rates, the power prices in liberalized power markets, and so on. And also some of these bottlenecks on the demand side that we're seeing will continue to play an important factor, because we know the supply chain is delivering, but sort of some of these bottlenecks on the demand side will be more and more important. Touching also quickly on how this is impacting the generation mix, right? Like we're seeing, close to a 20% penetration on the capacity side, but quite far away from those levels on the generation due to sort of normally lower utilization factors or capacity factors for solar PV compared to other energy sources. But what I also just want to mention here is that renewable energy last year surpassed 30% of global generation for the first time, and is also going to accelerate this year. And solar PV is now growing much faster than any other major renewable energy source. So it's still a bit lower in the absolute volume compared to both hydropower and wind energy, but you're seeing from the forecast that our solar PV is, growing much faster and will be sort of one of the main factors for why we think that the global fossil fuel demand in the power sector is declining. So this is sort of, a truly disruptive technology. And if we're seeing this strong growth rates materialize in the years to come, that will continue to play a major factor. So looking at the regional breakdowns, I think the Asian market is, of course, the most important one. And what is happening in Asia, and more specifically China, is, of course, determining if we're going to see sort of a major increase in the global growth rate this year or not, more or less no matter what is happening in Europe and US and so on. And starting with China here, we think it's going to be another record year for China with even more additions than last year. And touching first on the utility cell segment, there is very high activity. But also here in the Chinese market, we're seeing some bottlenecks starting to appear now, with some difficulties integrating all this solar into the energy mix. So this is, for example, reflected in curtailment rates or sort of some delays when it comes to network connections for all this capacity. So, of course, the development timelines for solar PV is, much quicker than grid development, even for sort of a country like China, which is building grid very fast. And this is not a new issue in some other markets like Europe, US, and Australia, but now it's also, in our view, starting to impact the Chinese growth. So we think it's a bit unlikely that we'll see sort of another, 50–60% growth in the Chinese market alone. And that alone is sort of a main reason why we think it's going to be a little bit of a slowdown in the global growth rate. But of course, we still think it's going to grow in years to come as well. There is a lot of room for solar to grow. The power sector in China is gigantic, and coal is still the dominant source there. So solar will continue to grow in years to come as well. We think that is the most likely scenario. Touching on the other Asian markets as well, currently they have a higher growth rate, and important markets here remain India, Japan, Korea, Australia, so on. And compared to China, the utility segment is even more important in some of these markets I mentioned, with the majority of the growth coming in the utility cell segment, and especially in developing markets where residential and C&I still are quite small markets. So the growth rates will continue to be very high. And as you saw in the snippet from Michael, for example, in India, solar is growing very rapidly now. And as I'll come back to later in the presentation, they're also building out their domestic supply chain quite successfully. Moving on to the Americas, it's a quite different story. We also think here, starting with North America, it's going to be another good year for solar PV. And of course, the US is the most important markets. And touching first on the utility side, we are seeing some effects now, not only caused by the high interest rate regime, because that's making it more tricky for developers to actually develop all these projects. So that's one of the major factors, while we're seeing actually a temporary decline in utility projects in the US. But there's other factors as well, related to grid bottlenecks, network constraints, and other factors that is hampering the growth in the short term for solar PV in North America. In addition to this, we have the residential and C&I markets, which overall is quite a bit smaller, but important markets like California, for example, which is by far the largest solar market. We have seen some changes in policies that is now impacting the growth now. And most year-to-date numbers are suggesting that there will be a reduction in the residential market in this year before it will start build up again already from next year. It's a quite different story in South America. There is, somewhat high activity level in the important markets like Brazil and Chile, but we don't see it sort of the project count. We're trying to track all the utility scale projects, and we are not seeing sort of sustained massive growth similar to the growth rate we're seeing in, for example, the rest of Asia. So the South American market is, of course, a massive potential market, and it is a relatively large market already. But the growth rate, we need much more announcement of projects and also better policies and sort of incentives on the residential side to boost the growth in this market further. And finally, rounding off with Europe, Middle East, and Africa, yet another set of drivers there, of course. So Europe had another record year last year, and in Europe, of course, we have the residential and C&I market being the largest market. So I can touch on that first. And as you see here, we actually think it's going to be a slight reduction in the total market size this year for residential and C&I. And that is also, I think, one narrative that is maybe useful to think about there is sort of this energy independence drive that really boosted additions in 22 and 23. and also the very, very high energy prices we saw in Europe, or electricity prices specifically, which incentivized a lot of solar PV additions. So power prices in Europe now, they're very much lower than what we saw in 22 and 23. So this is removing some of the incentive, and also temporarily we're seeing some signs of saturation in important rooftop markets. But important markets like Poland, Germany, Italy, Spain, they're still growing at similar growth rates to last year or even better. But other markets are seeing some signs of a slowdown. And touching quickly on the utility side as well, it's not the same view there. There's a record high activity, a very high activity in countries like Spain, Germany, Poland, not so much Italy maybe, but France also. So on the utility side, there is still room for a lot of growth. And we still think there's room for a lot of growth in the European market in years to come as well, with the solid numbers all the way to 2030. And the final region here, Middle East and Africa, the majority of these regions are currently in the Middle East and North Africa, and utility segment is really what is dominating there, a bit similar to what we're seeing in the rest of the Asia segment. And the growth rate is, very, very high. We're seeing sort of countries like the UAE and Saudi now really, really pushing additions, and this will really drive the market here to come. Just touching on sort of the importance of this in the energy mix, this is of course very important because these markets are very fossil fuels heavy at the moment, with a lot of gas and even still a little bit of oil in the power mix. So this is really one of the important decarbonization levers in these power markets. So quick summary on the demand side, we still see a lot of support for very high demand levels this year, sort of across all most important markets. But due to these drivers that we have touched on, which is sort of quite different between Asia, Europe, and Americas, the largest markets, we don't think it's going to be another sort of 60, 70, 80% growth rate this year. And that sort of the standout performance from last year will be difficult to replicate this year. So moving on to the supply side, I think the first thing that is sort of that I want to touch on here is just sort of the two things actually. First of all, of course, the massive ramp up we have seen in the last few years of manufacturing capacity across all the important parts of the supply chain, and also of course sort of the dominance by China and Chinese companies. And typically, the earlier you go in the supply chain, the more dominance you have from the Chinese players. While on the module side, in the final chart you have here, you're starting to see diversification in the supply chain, with important markets like India in brown here, and also US in green, starting to ramp up manufacturing capacity, and quite a lot of announced capacity in the pipeline that is under construction or will be built in the coming few years. But all this manufacturing capacity is, of course, resulting in a quite big mismatch between demand and supply, and this is, of course, nothing new. But if we're looking at sort of the demand side, we could say maybe there's around 500 gigawatts of demand this year, gigawatt DC demand this year, with a potential upside if we have a very, very good second half of the year. But even if there is a potential upside to this 500 gigawatts DC, you have already surpassed 1,000 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity globally. And this is based on bottom-up data, plant by plant, from all the major solar manufacturers. And this is, of course, resulting in quite a lot of things. So I'll get back to that. The most sort of maybe a clear result is, of course, lower prices, but it also has some effect on the consolidation among the Chinese players. A lot of capacity being run at low utilization factors, and of course, starting to hurt the margins of some of these big players. And just touching on the outcome as well, there's far from certain that a lot of all of this capacity will actually come online in the next few years. And we have already seen examples of existing facilities either being permanently shut down or temporarily shut down, and also some of the announced capacity that are expected to come online is cancelled. But even if that is the case, if a lot of this manufacturing capacity either is idle, running at low utilization factors, or even some of the upcoming capacity is cancelled, there will be this oversupply situation for many more years to come, in our view at least. I also want to quickly touch on some of the regional demand-supply balances, touching on Europe here first. So the European market, even if there is this push to bring more manufacturing capacity to Europe, even in the coming years, we're not seeing any steps of the supply chain being able to cover domestic demand. So Europe will remain a very, very important export market for all the exporting countries, and of course, most importantly, China. The same cannot really be said about the US, where of course there are quite different drivers and a lot of more trade barriers. And already from this year, the last steps of the supply chain on the module side, we will already have enough manufacturing capacity to cover domestic supply. And from next year, it will be a lot of additional supply basically on the last steps. But earlier in the supply chain on the polysilicon and wafer side, they will still be reliant on imports. And I think an even more clear example of this would be India, where, of course, this is something that we have seen a lot already from last year, with a lot of manufacturing capacity coming online. And India is already self-sufficient when it comes to covering domestic demand in the last few steps of the supply chain. But we're also seeing some capacity now being announced on the earlier steps of the supply chain. So India is really building out their domestic manufacturing capacity, and that will be important in years to come. And looking at the resulting trade flows, what we have seen in general over the last few years, with the chart on the left here showing the destinations for solar modules, and on the right we have the cells. First of all, there's very different set of countries when it comes to module trade and cell trade, and naturally from sort of how the domestic supply chains and demand supply balances are in these countries, with Europe and US still being top destinations on the module side due to the import needs in these markets. Also, the absolute volume is still very high, so we're seeing record high levels so far this year. So this is, of course, supporting this narrative about continued growth in the market. If we didn't see growth in trade flows, there, of course, there will be some storage as well. But of course, this is an indication that there is growth, for example, in the residential market, where it's typically a bit more, less clear in the middle of the year what's actually happening. And then on the cell side, we have India as the major player, and that's not very surprising from the previous slide. We saw that they already now have a lot of manufacturing capacity on the module side, but of course still need to import elements earlier in the supply chain. Yes, so that's on the supply chain side. We still think this oversupply situation will be there, this year and also next year, and will continue to be sort of an issue for the industry, but of course a good thing on the demand side with this example Michael showed with very low prices. And moving on to the prices, a direct result of this oversupply situation have been this large reduction in module prices in China and Europe. And for this selected segment, we have, in general, Chinese and European module prices are, of course, very connected because of very few trade bottlenecks between these two regions. And prices are now for this, selected segment between 10 cents and 15 cents per watt peak. So very cheap, which is resulting in sort of, good economics for a project developer on the cost side. There is this cost gap or price gap between China and Europe and the United States. And that's, of course, mainly coming from this, trade barriers, and more specifically the Forced Labor Prevention Act, that is really limiting US companies to import basically anything relevant for the solar industry from China directly. So this and as you saw in the previous chart, even if the US is starting to have enough manufacturing capacity on the module side, it's still quite far away from having the earlier steps. So this price gap will continue to be there unless manufacturing capacity is coming online quicker than we expect. That's the one option. Or some of these trade barriers are removed, which maybe is not the most likely scenario. And then I just want to move quickly on to some of the implications we've seen in the market, right? And the first one that I would say is sort of one of the truly disruptive forces in the energy market now is this reduction we have seen in solar costs and prices over the last few years. And this example I'm showing here is, of course, not representative for sort of a utility scale solar farm globally. But I still think it's an important example. So this is just one solar farm from Abu Dhabi, a very big one, the 2 gigawatt farm of Al Dhafra. And the developers have claimed a $13 per megawatt hour LCOE of this project. And of course, there's no other energy source that will be able to compete anywhere near close to this, right? With this simple metric. Of course, there's other more maybe suitable metrics to compare cost. But if we're using the LCOE, solar is competing with all other energy sources in almost all regions across the world around. And that's truly a disruptive force and will, of course, be the main reason, in addition to policy incentives, of course, for why solar will continue to grow and grow quickly in years to come. Another sort of effect that we have maybe seen in the last few years is curtailment, right? And we have tried to quantify this here by just looking at sort of the implied utilization factor or capacity factor for solar PV globally by just taking the yearly global generation and comparing it to the installed capacity globally across all the segments, utility and non-utility. And as you see at the bottom here, you can see that there was basically a pretty big reduction last year in the global weighted average utilization factor. And we don't think this is sort of a trend that is here to stay. You know, it could normalize already this year, but it's highlighting some of maybe the challenges from the demand side to actually allow for all this solar to be integrated efficiently into the grid. Touching on one more example as well, specifically for Europe here. That's more on sort of the demand side as well, I would say, but Europe is starting to reach a quite high penetration of solar PV now. And during the summer months when we have the peak, peak solar generation and also relatively low demand in continental Europe, we're starting to see very, very low capture rates now with important or high penetration markets like Netherlands, Spain, and Germany having capture rates all the way down to 60% in the month of May this year. And France is not having a very high penetration of solar PV, but of course it's a very high level of interconnectivity between France and these other markets here, which is also resulting in sort of lower utilization factors. So, and even if there is a relatively high penetration of solar in the European market, we still have a lot of growth ahead of us, right? So this will continue to be an issue from sort of the players in the market, and you could see capture rates continue to decline in years to come, reaching maybe 50%, 40%, and who knows who the bottom is, right? So this will of course continue to be a problem for those players who are exposed to the merchant market or to the spot market. And that's of course not the majority of these projects. The majority of these projects are on sort of fixed terms like PPAs or other tariffs or auctions even. But it's still an issue for industry, and will limit how developers are able to make money on solar projects. And the final thing I want to touch on before I leave the word to Abdallah is on curtailment. And the example I selected here is China, because I think we're all familiar with curtailment being a problem in markets like Europe, North America, and Australia already. But it's relatively new to see curtailment rising in China. So the trend this year has been higher curtailments from solar specifically compared to last year. So both these two charts are just specifically for the month of March, but it is representative for the year so far. And that is that increased curtailment rate across most of the regions. And if we're looking at this, a lot of the central regions, which is having a lot of this solar capacity that came online last year, we have seen sort of curtailment rates above 5%. And maybe an extreme outlier here would be the Tibet province with actually a 30% curtailment rate in March, which is quite extraordinary. But this is some of the things that is of course not the only factor, but one of the factors why it will be a bit more tricky to integrate sort of similar growth rate levels in China in the coming years as we saw in 2023. So I think that was the last thing I wanted to say for now, and I want to give the word to Abdallah for his presentations, and yeah, we will discuss more around these topics during the panel at the end. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Fabian. Again, if anyone has questions, please write it in the chat and we will then integrate it into our panel later on.